The metallic click of handcuffs against my grandfather's weathered wrists echoed through our front yard. I watched in disbelief as Sheriff Sheila roughly guided him toward her cruiser, his 83-year-old frame looking suddenly frail against her starched uniform. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their properties, phones raised, faces twisted in confusion. "You cannot do this," I shouted, my voice cracking as I rushed forward. "He built this town before you even existed." Sheriff Sheila turned, her mirrored sunglasses reflecting my own panicked expression back at me. "The law is the law," she responded coldly, "and your grandfather has been breaking it." Grandpa stood tall despite the handcuffs, his eyes finding mine. "Do not worry," he said quietly. "Truth stands longer than lies." The cruiser door slammed shut. Through the window, I could see Grandpa's silhouette, straight-backed and dignified even in custody. Sheriff Sheila approached me with a document in hand. "By tomorrow, that fence comes down or you will join him," she stated, pressing the paper against my chest. "Nothing personal, just maintaining standards." As the cruiser pulled away, I unfolded the citation with trembling hands. That was when I realized the ordinance she cited had been created just 3 days ago. My grandfather, James Harper, was not simply an old man with a fence problem. He was history personified in our small town of Millfield. At 83, his hands still remembered every callus earned from building homes across 3 counties. His memory cataloged every family name that had settled here since the 1950s. The creases around his eyes deepened when he smiled about the past, which he did often from his rocking chair on our wraparound porch. That porch, like everything on our 5-acre property, had been crafted by him. The house stood as a testament to craftsmanship. Solid oak floors that never creaked, windows that caught the sunrise perfectly, and walls that had sheltered 4 generations of Harpers. But what truly marked our boundary was the fence. The fence encircled our entire property, 6 feet tall, made of cedar that had weathered to a distinguished silver gray. Grandpa had harvested the wood himself from our back acres, milled it, and erected each post with mathematical precision 50 years earlier. Every spring, he would walk its perimeter, replacing any board that showed the slightest weakness. It was not merely a boundary marker. It was a testament to permanence. "A man defines his space in this world," he often told me. "Not to keep others out, but to take responsibility for what is his to protect." I had returned to live with Grandpa 3 years ago after my divorce. The city had drained my spirit, and his steadfast presence helped rebuild it. We shared quiet mornings over black coffee, tended the vegetable garden together, and spent evenings on the porch while he recounted stories of Millfield's early days. Sheriff Sheila Martin arrived 6 months ago. Millfield had always employed local officers, people who understood the rhythms and relationships of a town where family names stretched back generations. Sheila came from somewhere out east with credentials that impressed the town council and a promise to modernize our law enforcement. The changes began subtly. New parking restrictions downtown, citations for unregistered yard sales, fines for businesses whose signs extended too far from storefronts. Small things that accumulated into a quiet resentment among townspeople. Then came the day she parked her cruiser at our gate. I watched from the kitchen window as Grandpa greeted her with his customary politeness, offering a glass of lemonade which she declined. "Mr. Harper," I heard her say, consulting a tablet in her hand, "your property fence violates Ordinance 15C, subsection 4, which limits residential barriers to 4 feet in height." Grandpa leaned against one of the posts. "This fence has stood for 50 years, Sheriff. It predates any such ordinance." "The town council revised the code last month." Her voice carried across the yard, crisp and unyielding. "You have 14 days to bring it into compliance." "I will need to review that revision," Grandpa replied evenly. "This fence marks historical property lines established when I subdivided my original acreage to help form the eastern section of town." Sheriff Sheila removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes as cold as river stones. "Historical context does not exempt current regulations, Mr. Harper. 14 days. That evening, Grandpa spread town maps across our dining table. His finger traced boundary lines he had helped establish decades earlier. The town grew from this property, he explained. When families needed land after the mill expanded in '62, I parceled off the northern section. The fence has always marked what remained. The next morning, Grandpa visited the town hall to examine the ordinance. He returned with a troubled expression. The revision passed with minimal notice, he said, buried in a document of procedural adjustments. For the next week, neighbors stopped by to discuss the situation. Many expressed concern about Sheila's growing list of citations across town. She is reshaping Millfield through violations, said Frank Miller, who owned the hardware store, making us all feel like criminals in our own community. On the 13th day, Sheriff Sheila returned, this time with 2 deputies, no preliminary warning, no courtesy call. James Harper, she announced formally as Grandpa met her at the gate. The compliance period has ended, and you have failed to address the fence violation. I have submitted a historical property exemption request, Grandpa responded. It is still under review by the council. That filing does not extend your compliance period. Her hand moved to the handcuffs at her belt. You are being charged with willful obstruction of municipal code enforcement. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes as Grandpa was handcuffed. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street openly wept. The Johansson boys, whom Grandpa had taught to fish, recorded the arrest on their phones. I rushed forward, demanding an explanation, but was held back by one of the deputies. The last image before they drove away was Grandpa's face through the cruiser window, not angry, but profoundly disappointed, as if he was witnessing the betrayal of something fundamental about the town he had helped build from nothing. That night, our home felt hollow without his presence. The fence stood in the moonlight, casting long shadows across the property, shadows that seemed to reach toward the heart of Millfield itself. The holding cell at the Millfield police station had been built during Grandpa's tenure on the town council in 1978. The irony was not lost on me as I arrived there at dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and a change of clothes for him. The young desk officer, Deputy Wells, had grown up 2 streets over from us. His discomfort was evident as he processed my visitor request. "I am sorry about this, Riley," he said quietly, glancing toward the closed office door with Sheriff emblazoned on the frosted glass. "Your grandfather has been charged with obstruction and refusal to comply with legal orders." "He submitted an exemption request," I countered. "It has not even been reviewed yet." Deputy Wells lowered his voice further. "Sheriff Martin has expedited several processes since taking office. The exemption would have been denied regardless." The holding area contained 3 cells, but Grandpa was the only occupant. He sat straight-backed on the narrow cot, his white hair combed neatly despite having spent the night in custody. When he saw me, he smiled gently. "No need for worry," he said. "I have seen the inside of worse places during the war." I passed him the thermos through the bars. "This is outrageous, Grandpa. I have called Attorney Davidson. He is on his way." Grandpa took a measured sip of coffee. "In my 83 years, I have learned that power reveals character more than it shapes it. Sheriff Sheila is showing us exactly who she is." Our conversation was interrupted by the sharp click of boots on concrete. Sheriff Sheila entered the holding area, accompanied by 2 officers I did not recognize, not local men, but new hires brought in from outside Millfield. "Mr. Harper will be arraigned this morning," she announced without greeting. "The charges include municipal code violation, obstruction of justice, and resistance to lawful orders." "Resistance?" I challenged. "He cooperated fully during your unnecessary arrest of a senior citizen." Sheriff Sheila did not acknowledge my protest. "Additionally, while Mr. Harper was in custody, we received reports of an unsafe structure on your property. As a precautionary measure, a remediation team has been dispatched to remove the code-violating fence." The coffee thermos nearly slipped from my hand. "You cannot do that. Our property is private. We have not been convicted of anything. You need a court order." "Emergency safety provisions in the revised code allow for immediate remediation of public hazards," she countered. "The documentation has been filed." Grandpa's hand reached through the bars to steady mine. His eyes, clear and unafraid, met Sheila's. "Young lady, that fence has weathered 50 winters without incident. What stands on my land is not the hazard here." Her expression remained impassive. "The arraignment is at 11. He will be released on his own recognizance afterward, assuming there are no further complications." She turned sharply and exited, boots echoing like metronome beats. Attorney Davidson arrived an hour later, gray-haired and furious. He had known Grandpa for 40 years and had served as town attorney before his semi-retirement. "This is judicial overreach," he declared after reviewing the charges. "The ordinance revision was improperly noticed to the public. We have grounds for dismissal." The arraignment proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Judge Keene, newly appointed last year, recited the charges as if reading a grocery list. Grandpa stood with dignity, entered a not guilty plea, and was released with a court date set for the following month. When we returned home, the destruction was already complete. A crew of workers unknown to us had dismantled the entire fence. Cedar posts that had stood for decades lay scattered across the property line like fallen soldiers. The workers were loading the last boards onto trucks bearing the county seal. Grandpa stopped at the edge of our driveway, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Neighbors stood in small clusters along the street, watching in uneasy silence. Some approached to express support, but their words felt hollow against the visual evidence of violation before us. That night, Grandpa was unnaturally quiet. He sat in his workshop surrounded by tools that had built not just our home, but much of Millfield itself. His hands, still strong despite their age, rested motionless on his knees. "They have forgotten," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Forgotten what, Grandpa?" "What it means to be a town. Not just streets and buildings, but a covenant between neighbors. We built Millfield to shelter each other, not to police each other." The following days brought whispers throughout town. Some supported the enforcement of modern standards. Others expressed outrage at the treatment of a town elder. The division was palpable at the grocery store, the post office, the diner. Places where Millfield had always found consensus now became battlegrounds of muttered opinions. I tried 3 times to meet with Sheriff Sheila. Each attempt was rebuffed with bureaucratic precision. "The sheriff is unavailable. This is an ongoing legal matter. Please direct inquiries through proper channels." On my 4th attempt, she finally agreed to a 5-minute meeting. Her office walls were bare of personal items, the desk immaculate. She remained standing as I entered, maintaining the height advantage her position afforded. "Ms. Harper, continuing to contest this matter only prolongs the community disruption." "The only disruption is your vendetta against my grandfather," I responded, "a respected founding resident of this town." Her expression did not change. "The law is the law. It applies equally regardless of tenure or reputation. Your grandfather refused to comply with clear municipal directives." "Directives you engineered," I countered. "The council passed the ordinance amendments unanimously." Her tone remained clinical. "Your time is up, Ms. Harper. I suggest focusing your energy on compliance rather than resistance." As she ushered me out, I noticed a map of Millfield on her desk, properties highlighted in various colors, with notes and arrows marking specific areas. Our property was circled in red. When I returned home, Grandpa sat motionless on the porch, staring at the boundary where his fence had stood. For the first time since my childhood, his shoulders were slumped in defeat. The Millfield Historical Society occupied the old train station at the edge of town. Its red brick walls and arched windows had withstood a century of seasons. Inside, Francis Miller, 81 years old and keeper of the town's collective memory, maintained archives that chronicled Millfield's evolution from lumber outpost to thriving community. I found her cataloging photographs when I arrived, her magnifying glass hovering over black and white images of men standing proudly before half-constructed buildings. "Riley," she greeted me warmly. "I heard about James. Absolutely disgraceful how he has been treated." "That is why I am here, Francis. People have forgotten who he is, what he means to this town. I need proof. Frances removed her reading glasses. Proof is everywhere you look in Millfield. Your grandfather's handprints are in the concrete of the elementary school steps. His signature is on the deed transfers that created half the neighborhoods east of Main Street. For the next 3 hours, Frances and I excavated the physical evidence of Grandpa's legacy. We uncovered town council minutes from 1965, documenting his proposal to establish Millfield's first community development plan. Photographs showed him breaking ground on the volunteer firehouse in 1971. Newspaper clippings detailed his donation of 10 acres for the creation of Harper Park in 1983. Most significant was a large survey map from 1962, showing the original Harper property, nearly 1/4 of what now constituted eastern Millfield. Grandpa had systematically subdivided and sold parcels at below-market rates to families seeking to establish themselves after the lumber mill expanded operations. He could have been wealthy, Frances commented, if profit had been his motive. Instead, he built a community. The archive contained dozens of letters from townspeople thanking James Harper for his assistance during difficult times, helping rebuild after storms, extending private loans during economic downturns, organizing community harvests when farms struggled. The Millfield that existed today had been shaped by his vision and generosity. Why is none of this displayed prominently? I asked, gesturing to the historical exhibits that lined the society's walls. Frances sighed heavily. The new historical commission has been modernizing our focus. They suggested James and the other founding families represented an outdated narrative. They preferred highlighting the architectural features of buildings rather than the people who built them. I gathered copies of the most compelling documents: the original town plan bearing Grandpa's signature, photographs of him with 3 generations of town mayors, newspaper editorials praising his contributions to Millfield's development. People need to remember, I said, carefully organizing the materials into a folder. Not just for Grandpa's sake, but for the town's identity. That evening, I spread the historical documents across our dining room table. Grandpa entered silently, his eyes widening as he recognized images from decades past. "Where did you find these?" he asked, gently touching a photograph of himself and a dozen other men raising the frame of the community center. "The Historical Society. Frances helped me. Grandpa, your contribution to Millfield is documented extensively. Sheriff Sheila cannot erase that." He picked up the original property survey, tracing the boundaries that had once encompassed much more than our current acreage. "It was never about ownership," he said quietly. "It was about stewardship." I watched as he methodically examined each piece of evidence of his life's work, his expression shifting between pride, nostalgia, and growing resolve. These weren't just documents, they were proof of a covenant between a man and his community. "The fence," he said finally, "was never about keeping people out. It marked a promise that what remained would always serve as home to any Harper who needed shelter." Throughout the next day, I visited longtime residents, sharing copies of the historical records. The Johansons, whose grandparents had purchased their land from Grandpa in 1967. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose late husband had apprenticed under Grandpa to learn carpentry. The Millers, whose hardware store had been financed with Grandpa's personal loan during the recession of 1979. Each conversation reinforced what many had forgotten or never known, that James Harper had laid both the physical and social foundation of modern Millfield. Their expressions of surprise and renewed respect confirmed what I had suspected. Sheriff Sheila was systematically disconnecting the town from its own history, making it easier to reshape according to her vision. At the coffee shop, I overheard 2 council members discussing upcoming projects. "The Eastern Zone is prime for redevelopment," one said. "Most residents there don't even have updated deeds or property surveys." The Eastern Zone, where Grandpa had helped families settle decades ago, where handshake agreements had sometimes substituted for formal documentation in a more trusting era. I returned home to find Grandpa standing at the property line, staring at the empty space where the fence had stood. But his posture had changed, back straight, head high, the defeat of previous days replaced with something resembling purpose. "They do not get to erase us, Riley," he said without turning. "A town is not buildings or ordinances, it is memory and promise. If Sheriff Sheila wants to rewrite our story, she will find that some chapters cannot be removed." I stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, 2 generations of Harpers surveying land that told our family's story, and by extension, Millfield's. The absence of the fence no longer represented violation but opportunity. The boundary had been erased, but the legacy it enclosed remained intact, waiting to be reclaimed. The official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp white paper bearing the Millfield Police Department letterhead, placed conspicuously between our screen door and main entrance. I retrieved it before Grandpa could see it, though I suspected its contents would only strengthen his renewed resolve. "Notice of municipal code violation," read the bold header. Below it, in meticulously typed detail, Sheriff Sheila had cited us for improper lawn maintenance constituting public nuisance and obstruction of municipal sightlines. The supposed violations referred to Grandpa's garden hose, temporarily coiled near the driveway, and the rose trellis that had stood beside our mailbox for 20 years. The final paragraph contained an unmistakable threat. Continued noncompliance with municipal standards will result in daily accruing fines of $150 until remediation is complete. I was contemplating the notice when Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at our gate, clutching a similar document. Her hands trembled as she held it out. "They say my bird feeders are creating a public health hazard," she explained, her accent thickening with emotion. "And my clothesline violates aesthetic standards. Riley, I cannot afford these fines on my pension." Before I could respond, Frank Miller's truck pulled into our driveway. He emerged holding his own citation. "Wind chimes," he stated flatly. "Apparently, the wind chimes my late wife hung on our porch create noise pollution, according to some subsection of a noise ordinance I never heard of until today." By noon, 7 neighbors had gathered in our kitchen, each bearing nearly identical notices with different specified violations. All had received them within hours of my visits the previous day, sharing Grandpa's historical documents. The pattern was undeniable. Sheriff Sheila was systematically targeting anyone who aligned with us. "This is intimidation," I said, arranging the notices side by side on the table. "She is using her authority to silence support for Grandpa." "But why?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez. "What does she gain from this?" Frank Miller leaned forward. "Control, pure and simple. I have seen this before in the town where my brother lives. New administration comes in, establishes authority through petty enforcement, then starts reshaping zoning for commercial development once resistance is broken." Grandpa entered the kitchen, his expression betraying no surprise at the gathering. He studied the collection of notices without comment, then retrieved a leather-bound book from his study, the original Millfield Town Charter, which he had helped draft in 1960. "Article 7, he read aloud, his voice steady. "The enforcement of municipal ordinances shall serve the welfare and harmony of the community, not as instruments of financial burden or personal intimidation." He closed the book gently. "They may have revised the ordinances, but the charter remains the foundation of Millfield's governance." After our neighbors departed, I showed Grandpa the map I had glimpsed in Sheriff Sheila's office, or rather, my recreation of it from memory. The properties currently receiving citations formed a pattern along the eastern edge of town, precisely where the most original Harper land divisions existed, where deeds might be oldest and most vulnerable to legal challenges. "She is isolating targets," Grandpa observed, "starting with those she perceives as weakest: seniors, fixed-income residents, properties with historical exemptions." That afternoon, I drove to the county seat and purchased a high-definition camera and voice recorder. If Sheriff Sheila intended to pressure us through documentation, we would respond in kind. The next morning, she arrived personally to inspect our remediation efforts. I met her at the edge of our property, camera visibly recording in my hand. Her eyes narrowed at the sight. Recording a law enforcement officer requires notification in this jurisdiction, she stated. I am notifying you now, I replied evenly. And this is private property where we have full documentation rights. Sheriff Sheila gestured toward the areas cited in her notice. The violations remain unaddressed. This constitutes willful noncompliance. We contest the validity of these citations, I responded, maintaining a calm I did not feel, especially given the pattern of targeted enforcement following our review of historical property records. Something flickered across her expression, momentary surprise that we had connected these dots, quickly masked by professional indifference. Your historical sentimentality does not exempt you from current municipal standards, she stated. Millfield is modernizing its enforcement protocols to align with county development objectives. Development objectives that were never publicly discussed or approved, I noted, continuing to record. She removed her sunglasses, looking directly into the camera lens. Daily fines will commence tomorrow. I suggest compliance rather than futile resistance, Ms. Harper. Your grandfather has already experienced the consequences of defiance. As she turned to leave, I called after her. You do realize we are documenting every interaction, every selective enforcement, every procedural irregularity. Sheriff Sheila paused but did not turn around. Documentation works both ways, Ms. Harper. I would be careful about what actions you take next. That evening, 3 more neighbors received citations. The following day, 5 more. Each violation more trivial than the last, decorative stones, improperly arranged. Mailbox posts, excessively ornamental, porch furniture unnecessarily visible from public thoroughfares. The pattern was expanding beyond our immediate neighborhood. Citations appeared at homes throughout Millfield, creating an atmosphere of anxious compliance. People began removing personal touches from their properties. Wind chimes disappeared, garden ornaments vanished, porch gatherings moved indoors away from potential observation. Frank Miller's prediction was materializing before our eyes. Sheriff Sheila was systematically breaking the town's spirit through bureaucratic intimidation. I established a documentation system, photographing each citation, recording every interaction with law enforcement, creating a timeline of enforcement actions. The evidence revealed undeniable patterns. Citations issued almost exclusively to properties with historical connections or to residents who had expressed support for Grandpa. She is counting on fear, Grandpa observed as we reviewed the growing documentation. Fear isolates. Isolated people cannot mount effective resistance. Then we need to counter with connection, I replied, an idea forming. She expects us to retreat. What if we do the opposite? The Millfield Public Library maintained digital archives of regional newspapers dating back 30 years. After a week of systematic citation harassment, I sought refuge among its quiet stacks, searching for any information about Sheriff Sheila Martin before her arrival in our town. The librarian, Eleanor Whitman, had worked there since before I was born. She found me hunched over a computer terminal, bleary-eyed from scrolling through endless municipal appointment notices. "Research project?" she inquired discreetly. I hesitated, then decided truth served better than vague explanations. I am looking into Sheriff Martin's professional background. Her enforcement actions have been concerning. Eleanor glanced toward the library entrance, then lowered her voice. You might want to examine the Riverside Gazette archives from 2018-2020, specifically their coverage of Mapleton County. Mapleton, I questioned. That is 2 counties over. Before she was Sheriff Martin of Millfield, she was Deputy Martin of Mapleton, Eleanor replied. I have family there. The name left an impression. With this new direction, my search yielded immediate results. The Riverside Gazette had published a series of articles about controversial property code enforcement in Mapleton County, focusing on a neighborhood called Lakeside Heights. The language was carefully neutral, but the pattern described was unmistakable: aggressive citation of code violations in an established neighborhood, followed by property devaluations, followed by land acquisition for commercial development. One article specifically mentioned Deputy S. Martin, as the primary enforcement officer for the initiative. A subsequent piece noted community protests when several elderly residents were forced to sell homes they could no longer maintain to municipal standards. Most revealing was an editorial questioning the relationship between the code enforcement campaign and County Commissioner Walter Prescott, who had business connections to the development company that eventually purchased the devalued properties. I printed the articles, hands trembling slightly as I recognized the blueprint being replicated in Millfield. But the most significant piece came from a small community newsletter published by Lakeside Heights residents during the conflict. A grainy photograph showed a younger Sheila Martin standing beside Commissioner Prescott at a private fundraiser, both smiling as they raised champagne glasses. The caption read, "Deputy Martin celebrates with Commissioner Prescott at private event announcing Lakeside Heights revitalization project, 3 months before public disclosure of development plans." I checked county records next. Walter Prescott had indeed served as Mapleton County Commissioner until a sudden resignation in 2020, citing personal reasons. The timeline coincided with Sheriff Martin's departure from Mapleton and subsequent appearance in our region. Most intriguing was a brief mention in court records. A civil complaint filed by several Lakeside Heights residents alleging procedural misconduct in code enforcement was dismissed on technical grounds, with all records subsequently sealed by judicial order. The library was preparing to close when I uncovered perhaps the most valuable resource, the name of Judith Warner, a reporter who had authored most of the Gazette's coverage of the Lakeside Heights controversy. A quick search revealed she now worked for a regional news outlet based in the state capital. At home, I arranged the printed materials across the dining room table for Grandpa to examine. His expression remained stoic as he methodically reviewed each piece, occasionally making notes in the margins. "The pattern is identical," he concluded finally. "Begin with minor violations, escalate to financial pressure, target vulnerable properties first to establish precedent, create compliance through fear before addressing more valuable parcels." Commissioner Prescott resigned abruptly after a sealed court proceeding, I added. "Something happened that neither he nor Sheriff Martin wants public." Grandpa studied the photograph of Sheila and Commissioner Prescott. "In my experience, when public officials celebrate privately before public announcements, financial interests are aligned beneath the surface." The next morning, I placed a call to Judith Warner at the regional news office. After explaining my situation, she agreed to speak off the record. "Lakeside Heights was a travesty of public administration," she stated bluntly when I described the parallels to Millfield's situation. "Deputy Martin executed the enforcement campaign with remarkable efficiency. Elderly homeowners who had lived there for decades suddenly found themselves unable to comply with selectively enforced codes." "What happened with the lawsuit?" I asked. A long pause followed. "That is where things get complicated. The case was building strong momentum until 3 plaintiffs suddenly withdrew. The judge, who had social connections to Commissioner Prescott, seized the opportunity to dismiss the entire matter. Records were sealed under the pretext of protecting private citizen information. And Deputy Martin transferred 2 weeks later. The official statement cited career advancement opportunity. Unofficially, sources told me she received a substantial performance bonus before departure." Judith's voice lowered further. "I continued investigating after she left, focusing on the financial connections between Commissioner Prescott and Westlake Development Group. 3 days into that research, my editor informed me the story was being permanently shelved." "Was there pressure from above?" My editor never said explicitly, but his exact words were, "Some stories cost more than they're worth." 2 months later, our newspaper received a substantial advertising contract from businesses connected to Westlake Development. After thanking Judith for her insights, I asked the question that had been forming since beginning this investigation. "Would you be willing to review our documentation of what is happening in Millfield? Perhaps there is enough distance now to revisit the pattern." Her response was cautious but encouraging. "I cannot promise publication, but I can certainly examine what you have collected. Sometimes patterns become more compelling when they repeat. That evening, as Grandpa and I consolidated our findings, headlights swept across our front windows. A police cruiser had parked at our gate, but instead of Sheriff Sheila, Deputy Rhodes emerged, a Millfield native who had joined the force before her arrival. He approached our porch with visible anxiety, constantly glancing back toward his vehicle. "Ms. Harper," he said quietly, "I cannot stay long, but you should know there was a meeting today between Sheriff Martin and representatives from Eastern Regional Development Corporation. They reviewed property maps of Millfield's eastern section." "My grandfather's original land divisions," I noted. Deputy Rhodes nodded. "The sheriff has established an accelerated citation schedule targeting specific properties. The department has been instructed to document all interactions as hostile, regardless of resident conduct." "Why are you telling us this?" Grandpa asked. The deputy's expression reflected internal conflict. "My family has lived in Millfield for 4 generations. My grandfather purchased this land from you, Mr. Harper. What is happening now? It violates the oath I took to serve this community." After he departed, Grandpa and I sat in silence, processing this confirmation of our suspicions. Sheriff Sheila was not merely an overzealous law enforcement officer. She was the advance agent for a coordinated development strategy that had succeeded elsewhere and was now targeting Millfield. "We need more than historical sentiment to fight this," Grandpa said finally. "We need to expose the entire pattern not just to Millfield, but to county authorities who might actually intervene." I nodded, thinking of the documentation we had accumulated, the connections to Mapleton, and Judith Warner's cautious interest in our situation. "They have tried this before and succeeded," I said, "but they have never faced someone with as much historical documentation as you, Grandpa, and they have never had their methods exposed across multiple jurisdictions." For the first time since the fence came down, Grandpa smiled, not with joy, but with the determined expression I recognized from childhood whenever he tackled a challenging building project. "Then let us build something they cannot tear down," he said, "the truth." The decision to fight back came to me as I stood in my grandfather's empty garden, staring at the dirt outline where his fence once stood. It was not merely about wood and nails anymore. It was about legacy, about truth. I began collecting everything. Old photographs yellowed with age, newspaper clippings from the town's inception, handwritten letters of gratitude from families whose homes my grandfather had helped build. Each piece of evidence felt like ammunition against the narrative Sheriff Sheila had constructed. The community center agreed to host what I called Founders' Day, though everyone understood its true purpose. I spent 3 sleepless nights arranging displays, creating timelines, and transferring my grandfather's oral stories onto placards that would speak when he could not. When the day arrived, I worried no one would come. Sheriff Sheila had created an atmosphere of fear in our once peaceful town, but by noon the parking lot overflowed. Families arrived carrying additional photographs and mementos. Elder residents came with stories. Young parents brought children who deserved to know their town's true history. My grandfather entered last, his shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible burden. When he saw the turnout, dozens, then hundreds of townsfolk, his posture straightened. His eyes, dulled since his arrest, regained their characteristic sharpness. "This is your grandfather?" asked Mrs. Lowenstein, a recent transplant who had sided with Sheila during the fence dispute. She stood before a black and white photograph showing my grandfather breaking ground for the town's first volunteer firehouse. "Yes," I replied, "and that building still stands today." Through the afternoon, I watched something powerful take hold. Neighbors who had become strangers reconnected over shared memories. Those who had feared speaking out found their voices again. My grandfather moved through the crowd like royalty, receiving handshakes and embraces from people whose lives he had touched. "He donated the land where my daughter's school stands," one man told another. "When the flood came in '82, he housed 3 families in his barn," added an elderly woman. I had mounted speakers playing recordings of my grandfather's stories. His voice, strong and clear, describing how the town had survived hardships, built itself up, and maintained its character through decades of change. Near the event's conclusion, I noticed a police cruiser moving slowly past the community center. Behind the wheel sat Sheriff Sheila, her silhouette unmistakable. She did not stop. She did not attempt to disperse our gathering. She simply watched, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses. But something had shifted. For the first time since she had arrived in our town, it seemed that Sheriff Sheila felt what we had all experienced under her rule: powerlessness in the face of collective memory and shared truth. As dusk fell and people reluctantly began to leave, an elderly councilman approached me. "You have reminded us who we are," he said, his voice breaking, "and perhaps who we should never have stopped being." My grandfather stood at the exit, thanking each person individually. His back was straight again, his handshake firm. The night had transformed him from accused to accuser, from victim to victor. History had been reclaimed, and Sheriff Sheila, for all her badges and ordinances, could not erase what had been etched into the fabric of our community. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since that fence came down, I believed we could win. The cease and desist letter arrived at exactly 8:00 a.m. the following morning. The envelope bore the official seal of the sheriff's department, but the vindictiveness inside was purely Sheila's. I read it twice, my hands trembling with each threatening paragraph. Dissemination of false information damaging to law enforcement, potential civil and criminal penalties, immediate retraction of all statements made during unauthorized public gathering. Sheriff Sheila had escalated our personal conflict into legal territory. The letter demanded I publicly apologize for misleading the community and undermining the authority of duly appointed law enforcement. Each word was carefully crafted to intimidate, to silence. I called 3 lawyers that morning. None would take the case. "Sheriff Sheila has connections with the judge," one admitted reluctantly. "I cannot afford to make an enemy of the court." By afternoon, news spread that Sheila had petitioned the city council to ban unauthorized historical exhibitions without proper permits that would require her personal approval. The council, long cowed by her aggressive tactics, scheduled an emergency session to vote on her proposal. My grandfather read the cease and desist letter silently, his weathered hands steady against the crisp paper. "They tried this before," he said finally. "When they wanted to build the highway through the old cemetery, they thought paperwork could bury truth." Later that evening, an unexpected knock at our door startled us both. I approached cautiously, peering through the side window. A man in the tan uniform of the sheriff's department stood on our porch, his head bowed. I recognized him as Deputy Rhodes, one of Sheila's most loyal officers. "I am not here officially," he said when I cracked the door open. His voice was low, urgent. "May I come in?" Inside, Rhodes removed his hat and badge, placing them deliberately on our kitchen table. "I resign today," he announced, meeting my gaze directly. "After 3 years of service under Sheriff Sheila, I cannot continue to enforce what I know to be wrong." My grandfather offered him coffee, treating him not as an enemy but as a guest. Rhodes accepted with visible relief. "She has gone too far," Rhodes continued, his coffee untouched. "The citations, the arrests, none of it was about public safety or community standards. It was about revenue, about control." From his jacket, Rhodes produced a small flash drive. Internal memos, emails between Sheila and the county treasurer, ticket quotas, financial projections based on property seizures. She has been systematically targeting properties she deems valuable for future development. I inserted the drive into my laptop. Document after document confirmed what we had suspected but could never prove. Sheriff Sheila had not come to uphold the law, but to use it as a weapon for financial gain. The fence violations, the lawn citations, all were pretexts for a larger scheme. "Why are you giving this to us?" my grandfather asked, studying Rhodes with wise, careful eyes. "Because I became an officer to protect people," Rhodes answered simply, "not to terrorize them." That night, after Rhodes left, my grandfather and I carefully organized the evidence, creating backup copies and secure digital files. We needed to move quickly but strategically. Sheila would not hesitate to destroy evidence if she suspected what we possessed. "We need to take this higher than the town," I said, scrolling through State Oversight Committee contacts. "The State Attorney General's office handles law enforcement misconduct." "Be careful," my grandfather warned. "Sheila will not surrender her power without a fight, and cornered predators are the most dangerous." His words proved prophetic. At midnight, our power mysteriously went out. Through the darkness, I spotted the unmistakable outline of a patrol car idling down the street, its occupant watching our darkened home. The message was clear. Sheriff Sheila was watching, waiting, and prepared to strike. But what she did not yet realize was that we were no longer alone in our fight. And unlike her fence demolition, the foundation we were building would not collapse with a single blow. The town hall meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. Typically, these gatherings attracted only the most civic-minded residents, rarely more than 20 people discussing mundane matters like street repairs and seasonal decorations. This night was different. By 6:30, the parking lot overflowed. People stood along walls, sat in aisles, crowded the doorways. Sheriff Sheila arrived precisely at 6:55, flanked by 2 deputies. She moved with practiced authority to her reserved seat in the front row, acknowledging no one. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture rigid with confidence. She believed this was merely another performance in her campaign of control. The meeting began with standard procedures: roll call, previous minutes, announcements. I waited, the flash drive heavy in my pocket, tension building in my chest. When the council chairperson finally announced public comments, I rose and walked deliberately to the podium. "My name is James Harper's grandchild," I began, using my grandfather's name intentionally. "I am here to present evidence of systematic abuse of power and financial misconduct by our current sheriff." Sheila's head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing dangerously. One of her deputies stepped forward, but hesitated when confronted by the sea of attentive citizens. I connected the flash drive to the town hall's projection system. The screen behind me illuminated with the first document, an internal memo detailing revenue generation targets for citations in our neighborhood. "This is from Sheriff Sheila's department," I explained, my voice steadier than I felt. "It shows that citations were never about safety or community standards. They were about meeting financial quotas." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I advanced to the next document, emails between Sheila and developers discussing properties that would become available after enforcement actions. "My grandfather's fence was not the target," I continued. "His land was, our homes are, our community is." The silence that followed felt heavier than any noise I had ever experienced. It was the silence of collective realization, of betrayal understood. Then came the questions, first hesitant, then insistent, finally demanding. "Is this why my mailbox was suddenly illegal after 20 years? Did you target the Henderson property because it borders the highway access? Were you planning to sell our seized properties to developers?" Sheriff Sheila stood abruptly. "These documents are fabricated. This presentation is slanderous and illegal. I will not dignify these accusations with—" "They are not fabricated," interrupted a voice from the back. Deputy Rhodes stepped forward, still in civilian clothes. "I provided those documents. They come directly from department servers and email accounts, and I will testify to their authenticity." The room erupted. The council chairperson pounded his gavel uselessly against the wave of outrage. Sheriff Sheila's face transformed from confidence to rage to something I had never seen before: fear. Local news cameras captured everything. The reporter who had warned me about Sheila's past stood in the corner, broadcasting live. Within hours, state media picked up the story. By morning, what had begun as a local dispute about a fence had evolved into a regional scandal about corruption and abuse of power. The following day, hundreds gathered outside the sheriff's office. They carried signs, some bearing my grandfather's name, others demanding investigation and accountability. Sheila did not appear. Her cruiser remained parked behind the building, her office dark. At noon, the city council emerged from an emergency session. The chairperson, visibly shaken, approached the assembled crowd. Sheriff Sheila has been suspended effective immediately, pending full investigation by state authorities, he announced through a portable megaphone. Deputy Chief Williams will assume temporary command of the department. The cheer that rose from the crowd was not one of vindictive celebration, but of profound relief. People embraced, some wept openly. My grandfather stood silently beside me, his face a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow for what our town had endured. That evening, as the crowd finally dispersed, I realized something fundamental had changed. The fear that had gripped our community, silenced voices, and isolated neighbors had broken. We were not simply angry anymore. We were united. And finally, after months of intimidation, we were being heard. The state investigation proceeded with methodical precision. Investigators in pressed suits arrived with subpoenas, warrant letters, and digital forensic equipment. They commandeered the conference room at Town Hall, transforming it into a temporary headquarters for what one official called the most significant law enforcement misconduct case in the county's history. 3 weeks after the Town Hall revelation, the formal hearing began. The courthouse, a modest brick building that usually hosted property disputes and minor infractions, now contained the culmination of our struggle against Sheriff Sheila's regime. The courtroom itself was austere, polished wooden benches, the state flag hanging limply beside the bench, fluorescent lights casting everything in harsh clarity. Sheriff Sheila sat at the defendant's table, still wearing her uniform despite her suspension. Her attorney, an expensive import from the state capital, arranged documents with practiced efficiency. My grandfather and I entered together. He insisted on wearing his veteran's cap, medals displayed prominently. "They are not decorations," he had explained that morning. "They are reminders of what we fight for." The gallery filled quickly. Neighbors, business owners, even teenagers who had received citations for skateboarding on empty sidewalks. The air felt charged with anticipation and suppressed emotion. The judge, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair, called the court to order precisely at 9:00 a.m. "This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to pursue criminal charges against Sheriff Sheila Maddox for misconduct in office, abuse of authority, and financial impropriety." The prosecution called their first witness, Deputy Rhodes. He described years of escalating pressure to issue citations, implicit threats against officers who failed to meet quotas, and direct orders to target specific properties. Did Sheriff Maddox ever explicitly state her motivation for these enforcement priorities? The prosecutor asked. "Yes," Rhodes replied, his voice unwavering. "She said, 'Citations build compliance, compliance builds revenue, revenue builds power.' She said it during our first department meeting after her appointment." Throughout his testimony, Sheila remained motionless, her expression unreadable. Only the periodic tightening of her jaw revealed the rage beneath her composed exterior. When my turn came, I approached the witness stand with the weight of our community's trust. I described the fence incident, the arrest, the systematic harassment that followed. My voice cracked when recounting how my grandfather's dignity had been stripped away in public view. Sheila's attorney cross-examined aggressively, attempting to paint me as vindictive, emotional, unreliable. "Is it not true that your grandfather's fence was, in fact, in violation of the updated ordinance?" "The ordinance was updated 3 days before she issued the citation," I countered. "An ordinance my grandfather helped write 30 years ago when the town was first establishing its codes." The attorney's questions became increasingly hostile until the judge intervened. "Counsel, this witness is not on trial here." But the most powerful testimony came when my grandfather took the stand. He walked deliberately to the witness chair, his back straight despite his years. The courtroom fell silent as he was sworn in. "Mr. Harper," began the prosecutor gently, "please tell the court about your relationship with this town." My grandfather's voice, though aged, carried clearly through the hushed room. "I arrived here in 1946 after serving overseas. There was little more than a crossroads and hope. I purchased land, built my home, helped others build theirs. When we needed clean water, I helped dig the well. When children needed education, I donated land for the school. This town and we grew together. He described the fence, its purpose, its history. He explained the evolution of the town's governance from neighborly agreement to formal code. Codes he had helped establish based on community needs, not revenue potential. Sheriff Sheila did not just take down a fence, he concluded, his weathered hands resting lightly on the rail before him. She tried to erase our understanding of what community means. Law without justice is merely control. This town is built on trust, not tyranny. During his testimony, I watched Sheila's facade finally crack. Her shoulders slumped incrementally as the true weight of her actions became impossible to deny. The narrative she had constructed, of necessary enforcement, of community standards, collapsed under the simple, devastating truth of an elder statesman's experience. The hearing continued through the afternoon. Financial experts detailed the correlation between citations and departmental budget increases. Urban planners confirmed that properties targeted for aggressive enforcement aligned with development opportunities. As the judge adjourned for the day, the outcome seemed inevitable. Truth, systematically suppressed for so long, had finally found its voice. And despite Sheila's power, her connections, her strategic manipulation, she could not silence an entire community's testimony. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around my grandfather, their cameras capturing his dignified profile against the building he had witnessed being constructed decades earlier. "Are you confident justice will be served?" one asked. "Justice," my grandfather replied thoughtfully, "is never simply served. It must be continuously earned by generations willing to stand for it." The verdict came on a Thursday morning, delivered in the judge's measured tones to a packed courtroom. This court finds Sheriff Sheila Maddox guilty of multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of authority, and violation of public trust. She is hereby permanently removed from office and barred from future law enforcement positions within this state. No dramatic music swelled. No thunderous applause erupted. Justice, as my grandfather had observed, arrived not with spectacle but with quiet certainty, like sunrise after a long night. Sheila received the verdict without visible reaction, her posture still rigid with practiced authority, though it now commanded nothing. As officers escorted her from the courtroom, she passed within feet of where my grandfather and I sat. For a moment our eyes met. I expected to see hatred, perhaps threats of future retribution. Instead, I glimpsed something unexpected, the hollow recognition of someone who had sacrificed everything meaningful for the illusion of power. The following Saturday dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for rebuilding. My grandfather rose before sunrise, methodically laying out tools on the porch steps as he had done countless times throughout his life. By 7 o'clock, the first truck arrived carrying lumber, then another, then more. "I came to help," said Mr. Harrington, who had received citations for his garden gnomes. He carried a post-hole digger over one shoulder. "We brought coffee and sandwiches," announced Mrs. Everett, who had nearly lost her flower shop to Sheila's parking violations. Throughout the morning, they continued to arrive, families, elders, teenagers, carrying tools, food, memories, and determination. What had begun as a simple fence reconstruction transformed into something profoundly more significant. It became ritual, restoration, recommitment. I worked alongside my grandfather, watching him instruct young men on the proper technique for setting posts, the correct angle for hanging gates. His hands, though weathered by decades of labor, moved with renewed precision. Each nail he drove seemed to secure more than wood to wood. It fastened present to past, community to place. "The secret to a fence that lasts," he explained to a circle of attentive children, "is not just in the materials, it is in building it together. What one person defends alone can be taken. What a community protects together endures." By mid-afternoon, the framework stood complete, stronger than before, reinforced with both modern materials and traditional techniques. People signed their names on the inside of posts, children pressed handprints into wet concrete footings. This was no longer merely a property boundary. It had become monument. As the day's work neared completion, the mayor arrived carrying an unexpected addition, a bronze plaque mounted on polished oak. The council voted unanimously, she explained, presenting it to my grandfather. It will be installed at the main gate. The inscription read simply, "Property of James Harper, founding father." My grandfather traced the raised letters with his fingertips, his expression contemplative rather than triumphant. He did not weep. He smiled, the quiet smile of someone who had lived long enough to see truth prevail over power. That evening, as sunset painted the new fence in amber light, neighbors lingered, reluctant to conclude what had become a day of healing. Children played tag around tree trunks. Adults shared stories on improvised benches. Someone brought out a guitar. Another produced homemade wine from last summer's berries. I found my grandfather sitting slightly apart, observing the impromptu celebration with peaceful satisfaction. "What are you thinking?" I asked, joining him on the old garden bench. "I am thinking about fences," he replied, "about their purpose." "To mark boundaries," I suggested, "to protect what matters." He nodded slowly. "Yes, but the best fences have gates. They define space without denying access. They create rooms without building prisons." He gestured toward the gathering. "Some fences keep people out, but this one brings people together." In the weeks that followed, our town began its recovery. Sheila's name was systematically removed from departmental letterhead, office doors, and finally, from daily conversation. The new interim sheriff, elected from within our community, established a citizens' advisory board to review ordinances and enforcement priorities. The fence stood as both boundary and invitation, a physical reminder that communities must sometimes defend themselves, but never at the cost of their fundamental connections. My grandfather's legacy, temporarily obscured by Sheila's machinations, now found permanent expression not just in bronze and wood, but in the renewed spirit of a town that had rediscovered its foundation. One afternoon, I overheard a newcomer ask about the plaque by our gate. "That's James Harper's place," answered a longtime resident. "He helped build this town, and when someone tried to tear it down, not just his fence, but everything it stood for, he and his family reminded us how to stand together again." That, I realized, was the true justice we had sought. Not punishment, but restoration. Not vengeance, but remembrance. Some victories are measured not in what is destroyed, but in what is rebuilt, stronger, more beautiful, and designed to endure.